Thanks for being here. No introduction needed, but Jan is Goldman's chief economist, and thank you so much for making the time. I know it's busy. It was an MPC week,
It was a busy week, yes.
FOMC week,
Busy week.
but thanks for being here.
Great to be here, and thanks for having me. I wanted to talk a little bit about how much debt is too much, and the answer is I don't know. As far as the level of debt is concerned, I've always found it very, very difficult to find levels of debt or debt to GDP ratios just because they're so non-stationary and trend up in so many places where one can be confident that they're too high. But for many years, we've looked at a very simple flow measure of net borrowing, namely simply the private sector financial balance. Private sector financial balance I found to be a very useful indicator of excessive borrowing, and that's been true in the US, true elsewhere. So I've had this chart or some version thereof in my standard marketing handout for probably the better part of 20 years. Simply the difference between total income and total spending of all households and businesses, or equivalently, difference between the total saving and total investment of all households, businesses, or even more as another identity, the difference between the current account balance and the general government balance. And so this chart here just shows the US time series going back to 1960, and you can, I think, nicely see that there was a problem in the late 1990s, and there was a problem in the mid-2000s. So I think it's a very intuitive kind of yardstick of whether households and firms are spending too much relative to their income. When the private sector balance is negative, that means spending exceeds income, and that difference has to be funded with basically net debt accumulation, and often that ends badly. And I would say there are other measures of flow measures of debt growth, and these are fairly highly correlated. Real or nominal debt growth is fairly highly correlated with the private sector balance. I find it conceptually a little bit less appealing, though, because this focuses very much on whether the net debt accumulation is going into spending, and whether the level of spending at some level is excessive. And I think if you look at the sort of empirics of the private sector balance, I think it's reasonably impressive. So what I did here was basically take the crisis data set of Moritz and his co-authors, and I looked at 17 different economies, advanced economies. I basically sorted the observations on the private sector balance into standard deviation buckets. At the bottom there, the leftmost standard deviation bucket is -1.5 standard deviations. The rightmost one is +1.5 standard deviations. And then I looked at the incidence of a financial crisis in that data set in the following 3 years. And it seems like the private sector balance relative to its own history does a decent job in sort of sorting the probability of crisis or the incidence of crisis. The growth rate of real debt also does a decent job. Probably a little bit less impressive, especially when you're looking at very high observations, very extreme observations on the sort of excessive side. Private sector balance seems to be doing a somewhat better job than real debt growth. Of course, there are many permutations of real debt growth, but we've looked at a number of them, and in general, we've found that to work a little less well. And we've done some simple sort of logic regression analysis as well, looking at the probability of a crisis in the following 3 years as a function of the initial observation on the private sector balance, on real credit growth, and then a couple of asset price variables. And in general, private sector balance seems to be a bit better. Effectively, if you look at the third column of coefficients, it seems to knock out real credit growth. And again, we found that for a few permutations of credit growth. Now, another sort of horse race that I think is interesting is to look at the private sector balance relative to maybe a better known crisis indicator, namely the current account deficit or the current account balance. Once again, we also see some predictive value from the current account balance, but maybe slightly less impressive again than the private sector balance, and the same thing. Once again, it's true when you look at simple regression evidence. Current account balance effectively gets knocked out. I actually think that's quite an interesting finding because it has some bearing on an old theory of financial crises known as the Lawson doctrine, the Pitchford thesis, or the consenting adults view. I think in one of your papers you call it the consenting adults view, which is basically that current account deficits are fine as long as the decisions are made by profit maximizing private entities and don't reflect government overspending. That's the view, certainly was the view in the 1980s by Nigel Lawson, then the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK. And it seems to me, when I look at these results, that actually the opposite is true, that the current account deficits are particularly dangerous if they reflect private sector imbalances rather than government imbalances, at least as far as financial crises are concerned. So in some sense, that I think means that consenting adults don't always make very smart decisions. That's basically some of the historical observation. I would say right now, this perspective doesn't make me particularly nervous. When I look at the overall US private sector balance, it's about plus 4% of GDP. That's roughly the historical average. And it's certainly at a high level, conditioning on the fact that we're quite deep into an expansion. And that continues to be true if you split the private sector balance into households and nonprofits on the one hand, and corporates, or rather the business sector, corporate and non-corporate, on the other hand. That comes as a surprise to some people. There's, I think, not much discussion that, or not much argument that the household sector has not been excessively profligate in the last decade, but there is a view that the corporate sector has sort of gotten in over its skis, at least as far as kind of the financial balance is concerned. That does not seem to be the case. Finish up just by looking at some international evidence of where we stand right now in terms of private sector balances. Mostly it's a relatively reassuring picture for the largest advanced economies, the US, the Euro area, Japan. We see sizable surpluses, generally in line with, or maybe even a little bit above, in some cases, the historical average. There are a few countries where you have to be perhaps a bit more cautious. In particular, I would say the UK, which is running a sizable deficit, and Canada, which is also running a sizable deficit, and maybe to some degree, Sweden, which is running a very small surplus relative to history. So overall, looks like mostly clear skies as far as this is concerned, but there are a couple of English-speaking places or small open economies that look a little bit more concerning. Thank you.
And I happily hand over to Karen, who also needs no introduction. She was the chief economist of the Treasury under Obama and is now at Harvard at the Kennedy School. And please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to make just 4 quick points on the topic. I just want to start with the thought. By saying that credit is it's really good, and I think we need to keep that in mind, that it's important for well-being, and it's particularly important for households in kind of the middle and lower part of the distribution. I'm not going to go into this at length, but we know it's important for things like economic mobility and being able to get through rough patches. And I just bring that up because we know one way to kind of stop credit booms, which is we could just turn off the tap, right? And it kind of reminds me of I have a daughter who's a runner, and at some point she was suffering from terrible pain in her shins, and I went to this orthopedist and I said, can you help us? Can you stop this terrible pain? And he said, yes, absolutely. Just never let her run again, which was not the answer that anybody was looking for. But anyway, I just bring it up. Turning off the tap would be a kind of blunt way to do it that would have a lot of costs. When it comes to kind of how much is too much, I really think that the sustainability of credit for the borrower is a key consideration. No, we can't say kind of there's a magic level. I mean, because it matters, kind of the broader context matters. I mean, I made this point yesterday about kind of the amount of government debt we have right now. I mean, there's been a rethinking because with these lower equilibrium interest rates, any given level that you thought was kind of the too high for government debt 10 years ago, before we had kind of embraced this idea that there's been this big decline in equilibrium interest rates. I mean, it's got to be a kind of higher level now. So the interest rates matter for sustainability. Leverage, of course, matters for sustainability. We went through some big business cycles, in recent decades where job loss was really high, but we didn't see these huge waves of foreclosures or the financial markets imploding, and that's because households weren't so leveraged, so they'd lose their job, they couldn't pay their mortgage, they had to kind of move out of their home often, but they kind of escaped without, they sold it, and they, if they weren't underwater, they were able to sell it and kind of walk off without kind of all this pain of kind of foreclosure and all this kind of damage in the banking system. So that context matters. I would say my third point is I think we've made good progress in our ability to kind of judge sustainability. It's absolutely essential that you look at kind of not the average or the median or the aggregate. You need to be looking at the distribution, right? So you need to know kind of not average leverage. You need to know where leverage is at the 90th percentile. Just having been at the Fed in this period before the financial crisis, we didn't have these measures, and I think it would have made a big difference if we had kind of understood that there were these kind of, this big tail of households taking on all this risk. So now kind of regulators do have this data in real time. They are looking at it. I'm looking at my friend Mark over there. So that's terrific. So I think we've made progress. I don't think we've made all the progress we need to make. I think, as far as I know, they still don't have kind of debt relative to income, because you're using credit records, right? And you don't have income measures in those records. So I mean, that would be really nice to have, is debt relative to income. But the other point I want to make, which is just kind of a bit of a kind of stronger point, which is I actually think it's not enough just to have these data inside the regulators. I think they release kind of aggregate kind of debt to income and aggregate debt service ratios. It would be nice to see them releasing kind of data for different points of the distributions in real time, so that we could kind of debate this, and so that kind of investors understood, sort of that this risk was out there, and homeowners understood this risk was out there. The fourth point I want to make is, of course, the broader financial context really matters. I mean, the kind of what went on with households, that was kind of a necessary condition, but it wasn't sufficient. We knew in kind of early 2008 that millions of homeowners were going to kind of lose their homes We're going to be foreclosed upon. But you can go back and look at our forecast. I mean, they showed almost nothing happening to the economy. And I do this with my students, actually. I take them through a back of the envelope calculation. If you know 3 million people are going to be foreclosed upon, you know, what kind of effect is that going to have on the macroeconomy? You get just really small numbers. What we didn't understand was we didn't understand kind of how much, you know, activity had been pushed out to the unregulated kind of non-bank sector, and we didn't kind of understand this toxic combination of kind of high leverage in the non-bank sector and maturity transformation that made the sector so prone to runs. We also kind of didn't understand that we thought the banks were safe. We didn't realize the banks were also exposed to the stuff through the special investment vehicles and whatnot. So here too, I think kind of we made progress, but I think probably not full progress in judging that. Anyway, that's my 4 points.
Very good. Let me give one question back to both of you before then opening to the floor. You've both mentioned that in the past 30 years, since roughly 1980, we've seen this tremendous growth in aggregate credit and private debt. And yet, we talked about it yesterday, debt service ratios is very low, historically like relatively low. Of course, the variable that makes that possible are very low interest rates. So interest rates have fallen over the same period as debt has grown a lot. Are we in this low interest rate world looking forward into the future? Can interest rates, you mentioned equilibrium interest rates have come down. Are we, this is the world for the next generation we live in?
Sure. I would say, I mean, relative, if you take the period since 1980, highly likely, I would say yes, because certainly the first, 15 years of that period were still the kind of disinflation period, where very high real interest rates were basically the instrument to bring down inflation. If you take the period since the kind of late 1990s, how far below that the average we are relative to that period, I think is still a little bit more unclear. I think we're somewhat lower, but whether we're quite as low as the kind of latest numbers, the latest estimates of most of the kind of models of this would suggest. I'm not sure. I mean, take the Laubach-Williams model that's currently, I think, 40 basis points for real rates. There are some other models that are giving you something maybe a little bit closer to 1%. So if you take, we looked at, I think, a range of 7 different models that authors from inside the Federal Reserve System had produced, and the average was close to 1%. So 1% real, 3% nominal. It still would be significantly lower than history, but maybe not quite as low as some of the most recent estimates. But one big thing I think is around estimating equilibrium interest rates. It's really difficult, and you vary the approach by relatively small amounts, and you get potentially very different results.
Right. And before Karen answers, maybe if that's a permanent state for the world we will be in over the next years or decades, possibly, how do we need to rethink? With the Institute for New Economic Thinking, how do we rethink economic policy in an environment with permanently low real equilibrium interest rates? I mean, fiscal policy comes to mind, but maybe in terms of debt, there's also aspects that we shouldn't worry about debt anymore. Yeah. It's just there's no.
Yeah. So first of all, I agree with Jan. I think interest rates are probably lower now. They've kind of overreacted a bit, but I also believe the literature that says that kind of we've seen this decline in equilibrium rates. It's been for kind of reasons we think we understand. It's growing income inequality. As I said yesterday, the literature seems to conclude that's a piece of it, maybe 20 to 30%, but it's other things like population aging and buildup of kind of financial surpluses in emerging market economies. So I think So I think we're here to stay. I mean, as all these years in the forecasting business, it feels like every time we decide something is really here to stay, then it's not anymore. But so I want to be a little humble along those lines. I think actually households, is this a risk if interest rates rise? Well, actually, there is some sense in which we'd love it if we could get nominal interest rates higher, so we wouldn't have to deal with these nasty zero lower bound problems that central banks are struggling with. So there are, for example, proposals to kind of raise the inflation target, which would raise nominal interest rates, which is what matters in your kind of mortgage debt service. But remember, so many households are in fixed rate mortgages that I don't think that would be particularly disruptive
in the U.S.
In the
UK, I think.
Good qualified, yes, that's right, in the U.S. and U.S. here. In terms of policy, I think that, and this is just echoing some of the stuff that was mentioned in earlier sessions, I think the macroprudential policy is really important, and I think we've made good progress along some fronts, but I think we need to do more. I mean, I do worry that these low interest rates do make us more prone to bubbles and financial instability, and that these things like, notwithstanding your research, I think these counter-cyclical capital buffers, which we do have in this country, we do have the authority to use them, but it's a question of whether we ever will have the political will to use them. But I think that could be important too. It's not going to stop people from being over-optimistic, but it might stop people from acting on it so quickly. These things like being able to change loan-to-value ratios, which I know they do in some other countries. I think those things are all things we should be exploring.
Yeah, where do we need to rethink fundamentally the way we?
I don't have a lot to add. I mean, I think we do have to take into account equilibrium rates and looking at things like debt service ratios or certainly debt levels. So I don't have much to add there. On monetary policy, the obvious point is that stance of policy obviously depends on the gap between actual and equilibrium real rates. Although again, given that equilibrium real rates are very difficult to measure, I would also urge focus on kind of more what you see is what you get measures of the financial environment, like financial conditions indices.
But maybe certainly more room for fiscal policy in the future going forward.
Yeah, I think there's more room to the extent, in particular, to the extent that there is maybe a bigger gap between, the growth rate of the economy and the real interest rate. With the real interest rate lower relative to the growth rate than was previously imagined, that of course does give you more room.
Yeah, I think fiscal policy is going to need to play a bigger counter-cyclical role. I think, again, there's going to be another question of political will.
Which is going to be difficult if we have a recession sometime in the next few years, because the U.S. Federal budget deficit is close to 5% of GDP with a 3.6% unemployment rate.
Can I also just make, in terms, you're asking us what you should be thinking about, can I just make a plug for, is my consumer financial protection point yesterday for, better financial products for households, both on the debt side and on the savings side. We need kind of more than half the population having access to kind of retirement saving, workplace retirement saving plans. But I think having loans that are, thinking about what makes loans safe and unsafe. We talked earlier about when we were talking about over-optimism, and then we were talking about whether there was an interaction with frictions. I mean, frictions are what stop you from kind of acting on your over-optimism, at least acting so quickly on your over-optimism. I think the behavioral economics literature is screaming at us that, what we're really good at doing is kind of being nudged by things that are easy and automatic. So the fact that a traditional mortgage, you have to go through the friction of having to go through a refi, and doing a refi, I think the cash out refi is harder now than it was pre-crisis. I think those sorts of things, cooling down periods after you sign the paperwork on a student loan. There's for-profits, if you have ever heard about kind of their recruiting strategies. They try to get you in the door and not let you leave that day until you sign the paperwork. I mean,
Richard? Yes.
Jan, terrific comments. What would your private sector balance analysis look like if we looked at China today, and also what would it look like if we did the same analysis on Japan in the 1980s?
On China, it's difficult to draw a clean line between the public sector and the private sector because there are a lot of in-between kind of entities. So we, in this sort of analysis, including the regression analysis that I looked at earlier, we excluded emerging economies, and China in particular, I think, is quite difficult. If you can't at all distinguish between private and public sector, I guess you fall back on the current account balance. That wouldn't send a particularly concerning signal because China, of course, runs a current account surplus. But there are, of course, other aspects of debt booms, and there has been a very large debt boom, despite the really obvious financial deficits that I focused on here. So I certainly wouldn't go as far as saying that this is the only thing you should consider, and you should ignore, other measures, especially for countries like China. For Japan, it's I think this
in the 80s.
Sorry?
Japan in the 80s.
In 89.
Yes, was actually, they didn't quite run a private sector deficit, but they ran a very low private sector surplus relative to their own history. So their own history, and you can see it here, Japan has a very high average surplus. That goes, that was true in the, I think you can take it back further. And relative to its own history, the private sector balance actually sent a, I think, useful signal for Japan as well. And there are also some emerging economies where, data quality is a little bit more of an issue, but nevertheless, you did get a pretty useful signal, including Mexico in 1994, I think Thailand, Indonesia in 1997, also Turkey in 2000. So these were all places that ended up being hit with a relatively nasty financial downturn, where the private sector balance sent a useful sort of early warning signal.
Eugene, please.
So one issue which hasn't come up is financial literacy, and whether that plays an issue into having, is there too much private debt? Is that a valid and important concern?
I'm not an expert in the literature on financial literacy. I think it seems like it should. I mean, I think we know people don't understand complicated products. I think the literature is very kind of mixed on what, if anything, really works and kind of sticks when you're trying to do financial literacy. I think part of it is that, when they kind of test people on whether they're financially literate, I mean, the questions that they can't answer are so basic that, they're much less complicated than kind of a complicated new mortgage product. So I think for that reason, I think people tend to think better than financial literacy or disclosures. You gotta kind of actually nudge or block people from the more complicated stuff.
Also, financial literacy in the literature, I mean, I just educated myself because I teach a course on consumer credit market to my undergraduates, but it's highly correlated with other demographics, just having a college degree, having, high income. If you're financially literate, you tend to have high income, and, racial factors and so on. So I think it's sort of a proxy more than anything for, access and the incentive condition of having access to educate yourself more than other things equal. So it's sort of circular. My understanding is that one of the readings of the results in the literature of how this is distributed across different types of people and potential borrowers, it's sort of endogenous whether you become literate or not based on your access, and it's also very correlated with other variables that are also associated with sort of worse outcomes, and so it's more of a proxy than something. I think it's a source cause.
I should admit that David Leibson and John Campbell and I have just started teaching a personal finance course to Harvard undergraduates. So obviously I do believe in it for do believe it can have an effect along some lines. But it's a different group than
What's
what
the
we're
starting
talking
point
about.
of knowledge in that population?
We drew, I think, 160 people in our first class, and the numbers kind of went way down after that. The economics majors all kind of left because they already knew this stuff. But we were left with a fair number of humanities majors and kind of first gen people who maybe had a whole kind of family network that really didn't have this kind of experience.
Yeah, in the back, please.
Yeah. Thus far, your presentations just talked about aggregate debt. Does it make sense to look at the sort of the use of where that money is going? You know, so do you see a difference between corporate debt? Sorry, thanks. Do you see a difference between corporate debt in general and corporate debt directed towards a certain purpose, or the same with consumer debt? You know, is investing in education different than whatever?
Should we collect maybe?
Sure.
Yeah.
There was one here, and Natasha.
We spent a lot of time talking about expectations, and the FOMC just met, and we find out that there are 8 who think that there will be rate increases and 9 who don't. The other way.
Rate cuts.
Yep, my dyslexia hits every time. And what do you think was the Minsky moment in which we went from basically 1 or 2 who were calling for forecasting rate cuts, and none, most in the dot plots, rate hikes? What was the Minsky moment that caused the tip, do you think?
Can I add to this question, because it's for you, Jan, I guess. It feels like monetary policy has become ever more responsive to financial market developments. Is that a good thing, or is there a point where it's too much?
Yeah, so my question was about some themes that were raised earlier about what might be good about credit and what might be bad credit, and in particular, the role of government policy in it. So in England, we have a scheme called Help to Buy, which helps first-time buyers get onto the property ladder to buy usually houses that are fairly cheap. I mean, depending on what you mean by cheap, but under about £200,000. And that allows you to sort of only put 5% down, and the government provides the other 5%. I think something like that. And I would be interested in, just knowing what you think about this.
I'll go first. Let me maybe take Rob's question first.
Maybe unfair.
I mean, there was, in March, none of them thought that lower rates were likely to be appropriate, and now you have 8 for 2019 and 9 for next year. And it's a 3-month period, but if I had to identify one event, it was probably the threat of the Mexico tariffs. That's certainly, when you look at market pricing for rate cuts, that's when it really surged, and a number of forecasters also started forecasting cuts. So if you extrapolate that to the FOMC, it may have been around that time, maybe a little bit afterwards. It's difficult to know, but clearly there was a pretty sharp shift. With respect to Moritz's follow-up, is it a good thing that monetary policy is becoming more responsive to asset prices? I think in general, I think it's a good thing. I think it makes sense to respond to sizable changes in financial conditions. So for example, the pivot at the end of 2018, early 2019, away from once a quarter rate increases to basically no more increases, to me made a lot of sense, because you had seen a sharp tightening in financial conditions, and while the economic data hadn't deteriorated by very much, I think a very sharp tightening in financial conditions via lower equity prices, wider credit spreads, a stronger dollar, is almost like a negative data release, because these factors are pretty closely related to hits to aggregate demand in relatively short order. So that made it a good amount of sense. I think the most recent shift is, I have more doubts about that. And we don't really know the outcome yet, but I'm a little bit more doubtful because the response here seems to have been primarily to moves in the bond market and the expectation of large rate cuts, which the Federal Reserve seems to be unwilling to disappoint. And it does feel to me that if you're excessively deferential to market pricing, that there's a risk of kind of self-feeding mechanisms towards lower rates that might take you a ways away from where you ultimately need to be. I certainly don't think the bond market's infallible. I would always want to look at what the bond market's saying, but I've worked with bond traders for more than 2 decades, and I think sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong, just like the rest of us. I do think that you don't want to be overly mechanical in following market pricing. I think if you, certainly if the Fed had, sent a more hawkish message or less dovish message on Wednesday, you probably would have had some hit to asset prices. That probably would have meant some tightening in financial conditions. Whether that, how large it would be, I think is difficult to know. And the starting point is pretty loose conditions, so some degree of tightening, I think, actually wouldn't have been that big a deal necessarily. So I would, steer more of a middle ground. I'll stop there.
Okay, just quickly, because I know I'm standing between you guys and the reception, I think. So I have a bunch of thoughts. We thought a lot about these things when I was in the administration. So first of all, I do think kind of home ownership can be important for people. And I know it's kind of vogue for economists to say, oh, home ownership is so overrated. But particularly in countries, I don't know what's like in the UK, where there aren't good renter protections, I think actually home ownership is a commitment device that can allow you to build wealth, not through capital gains, but just by paying down your mortgage. And in a world where you have a large amount of the population that does not have access to like a workplace, retirement saving plan, it can be useful along those lines. And I think on top of that, at least in our country, people really want to own homes. Anyway, I think the lesson from the financial crisis was that there are good ways and bad ways for the government to intervene along these lines. In terms of kind of the mortgage you're describing, I guess my first reaction would be, as I said, I think the inequity can be a problem. It does present more risk for the homeowner if prices decline. I think the one that you're describing, I think the bad news is that sounds like the taxpayer's on the hook for the remaining 5% if prices decline by a whole bunch. The good news is that if it's the taxpayer on the hook, then it's not going to take the financial system down. So that's another thought. But I do think there are these interesting, when it comes to thin leverage, there are these interesting products. I mentioned this one yesterday, the wealth building home loan that's been put out by Steve Oliner and Ed Pinto at AEI. It's actually a very intriguing loan. It's a 15-year mortgage product, and the trick is you do come in with thin equity, but you start paying it down so quickly that you actually gain a bunch of equity pretty quickly. There are all sorts of bells and whistles that they put on it such that the payment remains affordable. And I have to say, part of the magic is that they do a kind of test that basically constrains you to buy a smaller house, which I'm not sure is a bad thing to constrain people to buy a kind of smaller house, because I think one of the problems is people, kind of particularly at the low and middle end before the financial crisis, they were over consuming. They had houses that were too big relative to their permanent income. So I just bring that up because I do think, the devil is kind of in the details.
Great. Thank you, Karen.
Let's thank our panelists.
Thank you, Jan.